Hello Year 10, welcome. This is the last week of the summer term and this is the last lesson before you enjoy your summer break. Therefore, we're going to go through the tasks that you need to do for this week and set you up for some work to be done over the summer. So without further ado, let's get cracking. If I share the screen and let's have a look. So the PowerPoint that we're using to explain it this week is this one. And again, we're using some work that's been done by Mr. Lehane with some input from other teachers. But the question the task we're looking at is contrasts. How does Charles Dickens use contrasts in A Christmas Carol? And on the screen in front of you, you have a reasonably straightforward contrast, which is at the beginning of the text. Scrooge is a misanthropic, miserly, stingy, hard-nosed character. He's an unchristian man in many respects. And by the end of the text, on the right-hand side, you have an image there of Scrooge with a smile on his face, carrying Tiny Tim, the son of Bob Cratchit, aloft. So his transformation, his metamorphosis is complete in these two images. This question is one that has been answered by Mr. Lehane, and we have a rather nice essay to read. The question, how does Dickens use contrast throughout the text? And what we have here on the screen is an example of what the first task is, which is identifying the keywords, the methods, and the synonyms that are used within the rest of the essay for yourself. So this acts as an introduction. It goes like this. A Christmas Carol is rich in contrast. The text is laced with Dickens's use of the contrast device. Dickens's authorial intention is to exemplify just how different Scrooge is to everybody else in his community. The division between Scrooge and his community can act as a metaphor for the division in Victorian society between the haves and the have-nots. The figure of contrast device helps to exemplify this. This could be tied into the depiction of Scrooge as a solitary figure, with the recurrent use of soul and the solitary imagery surrounding Scrooge. Now, hopefully what you gathered with my reading of that is that the blue words were where I had synonyms, I had options to choose from, and I did pick one of them. Those which are in black and underlined in bold, typically, they are the devices, the methods that have been used. So the first thing we'd like you to do is to read the rest of the essay coming up and select those words, select those keywords, the synonyms, and write them down, make a note of them. Print it off if you can, highlight it, annotate it onto the piece of paper. But more than anything, these are words and phrases that we want you to be able to wield and to use. So making a note of them is likely to aid that process. Certainly more than not making a note of them. So here we have an essay which continues. At the beginning of the narrative, Scrooge takes the Christ out of Christmas. He can be seen as a sinner who fails to adhere to the Christian message seen in the story of Cain and Abel of Am I my brother's keeper? As an outsider, Scrooge is an irreligious misanthrope who neglects his fellow man, and he certainly does not love thy neighbour as thyself. However, perhaps Scrooge is merely a lapsed Christian, as by the end of the text he is a markedly contrasting character. For example, at the beginning of the text, Dickens uses numerous religious allusions. We see biblical imagery around Scrooge's fireplace, which contrasts the way he lives avariciously. Dickens overtly contrasts Scrooge's hypocritical stance by displaying his anti-Christian actions, even though surrounded with such biblical images. Perhaps Scrooge is therefore a symbol for Victorian society, in that Victorian society claimed to be deeply religious, yet it introduced the New Poor Law of 1834. Dickens thus exposes the contrast between the public and versus the private. with Victorian society being publicly religious at the same time as being synonymous with workhouses and punitive actions through prisons. Scrooge is arguably a contrasting character to the rest of the society, therefore, as he is not outwardly religious at all. If anything, he is not hypocritical like all those around him, and this is possibly admirable in its own way. Yet, deeper exploration of his character reveals that this is not the case. Dickens ensures that Scrooge is implicitly critiqued throughout the text because it becomes apparent that Scrooge rejects society because it has rejected him first. Belle, his fiancée, releases him from their contract, and that's perhaps why Scrooge eventually rejects Christmas, which leads to the community he resides within rejecting him, and on it continues. Thus we see both a chain of events and a vicious circle that Scrooge cannot escape. Scrooge is wearing the chains he forges in life, much like Marley. Perhaps Scrooge is therefore a metaphor for, an emblem of, a symbol for a deeply flawed Victorian society that cannot help itself, leading to the visitation of ghosts to strike fear into Scrooge to catalyse the sharp change that is required. Now, I pause there because the line at the bottom of the screen, highlighted in red deliberately, is one which we can only really answer fully when we have read the rest of the text. So one method of contrast is to look at Scrooge at the beginning of the text and consider how he has evolved, transformed, altered, dramatically changed from the beginning of the text to the end of the text. Now, that's a particularly successful way to write about Scrooge and to write about contrast, but not the right one for us at the minute as we approach the end of stage 2. So instead, we have other devices that we can explore and that Mr. Lehane has explored. They're at the top. Caricatures, Christmas. The construction of caricatures is also a tool used to highlight how A Christmas Carol is rich in contrast. Remember, a caricature can be an exaggeration of positive qualities or negative qualities. Fred is constructed in Mother Teresa fashion. His goodness is revealed in his interaction with his uncle. Scrooge's verbal assault on Saint Fred highlights the contrast between the two personas. Scrooge's repeated utterance of "good afternoon" glaringly contrasts with Fred's saint-like act of forgiveness in inviting the monstrous Scrooge to Christmas dinner, and Fred's continued forgiving persona when the fly-on-the-wall Scrooge observes his nephew's festivities, and that's coming later in the text. A Christmas Carol is a narrative of contrasts. When Dickens sets his morality tale at Christmas time, the expectation is a celebratory mood to celebrate the Christian birth of Jesus. Dickens juxtaposes that expected mood of celebration and places it alongside the unexpected, such as Scrooge's non-celebratory melancholy dinner in his melancholy tavern. The celebratory and the melancholy, the miserable, the sad, the melancholy, conflict, and therein lies the contrast. Christmas is a time of togetherness, a time that conjures up an image of one universal party, a birthday party celebrating one birth, the birth of Jesus. However, the figure of contrast device helps to dismantle, to destroy, to unpick, to unpiece, to batter that togetherness imagery once we have Scrooge's isolated persona carved out on our pages. The exaggerative device, which is trademark Dickens, is put under the microscope with the hyperbolic comments regarding Scrooge's relationship with his fellow man, which is one of antipathy. Nobody ever stopped him in the street to say. This demon-like construct called Scrooge is set in an environment called Christmas, where a climate of celebration, unity, and harmony abide. It solidifies the figure of contrast device as a primary tool used by Dickens to preach his abiding, long-lasting, timeless, long-lasting, universal, for everyone, his abiding, timeless, universal moral that money cannot buy you happiness. And that's the end of Mr. Lahane's writing. And very lovely writing it is too. I might have had my 2 pennies worth as well, times in that. The point being that being able to write about a Christmas Carol ultimately requires you to write about contrast. And whether we do contrast in terms of the beginning of the text to the end of the text, or we do Christmas, which is a time of joy, which contrasts with Scrooge's miserable, miserly, misanthropic approach. Whichever way we do it, doesn't matter. The point is that we need to be able to write about contrasts in A Christmas Carol. So the first task, to reiterate, assuming my screen will now work, is this one here. Identify those keywords, make a note of them, ideally begin to use them. The next tasks are hopefully reasonably straightforward. Mr. Lahane is asking everyone in year 10 to find examples where we see Scrooge as the only one, the odd one out, the isolated, alienated, solitary individual. So find all of the examples in the text where we see him as singular, on his own. There are numerous examples of that. Look at Stave 1 in particular, but even as we continue into the Ghost of Christmas Past, the Ghost of Christmas Present, we will see how Scrooge is the odd one out. There is an example on the screen there for you. A second task, a series of questions to answer. How do we expect sensitive people to react at the death of a close friend or partner? And how do Scrooge's attitudes contrast with that expectation? Write up an answer, use full sentences, use quotations. The same applies to the second question. How does Bob Cratchit contrast with Scrooge? What are their differing attitudes to Christmas in the first stave? What are their differing demeanours or dispositions, their expressions, their attitudes, is what that means. And how do they celebrate Christmas differently? We will need to get to stave 3 to answer that question, so you can see that we're pushing you into the direction of reading the text. And the last question, which reinforces work done in a previous series of lessons set, how does the capitalist Scrooge contrast with the capitalist Fezziwig? And what's Dickens's intention there? So they're both money-making men, they're both wealthy men, but they're different. So what are the contrasts there? So each of these questions here is designed to encourage you to consider contrast in more detail. And therefore the last, and that leads us to the last task, which is about summer reading. We need you to read the text in full. And as you're reading the text in full, we want you to chart the way that Scrooge's character transforms. How does he contrast from the beginning of the text to the end of the text? So if I wiggle the mouse around here, see where the mouse is on the left-hand side of the screen. On the left-hand side, we'd like you to make a note of what Scrooge is like at the beginning of the text. Write it down. There should be as many bullet points as you can come up with, including quotations to justify and to evidence your findings, to back it up. English teachers will always want students to use the text. Use the text. Then, as you're reading, first time you read it, enjoy it. But it's not a bad idea to have a pen with you. And as you're reading, taking that pen, writing down, how is it that we see and you see Scrooge begin to change by the end of the text? Using quotations, evidencing your findings, will encourage you to know the text better. But the point is, we just need to see how Scrooge's character changes, how it transforms. And therefore, if we go back to the beginning of this, we know that very broadly, at the beginning of the text, he is this figure on the left-hand side, and at the end of the text, he is this figure on the right-hand side. But we need to know the specifics and the details. Evidently, this is work in addition to what you're doing in school this week, on the final week of term. Your teachers are very much looking forward to seeing you. This is all about preparing you really, really well so that we can hit the ground running in September. Until then, have a lovely summer. Do some work, but we'll leave it there for now. Thanks very much. Bye.